With the evocative title, Once Again the Mystery, the Argentine psychoanalyst Mariano Horenstein poses the equally enigmatic question: how do we listen to the language of sexuality today? Through an exploration of the relationship between language and psychoanalysis, and the historical transformation of the clinical paradigms that have shaped psychoanalytic listening to date, hysteria, in its origins, with its enigmatic language surrounded by silences, which inaugurated the analytical device; psychosis, which after the Second World War led to the expansion of the field, forcing us to give voice and testimony where the absence of repression predominated. The author shows us the trans clinic as a new paradigm that is currently emerging, not only because it requires the analyst to be heard, but also because it bursts onto the scene with its own voice and avatars of inclusive language, directly challenging theory and practice, and thus bringing sexuality back to the center of the psychoanalytic stage and debate. In 2022, Once Again the Mystery won the biennial Carolina Zamora Prize, awarded by the Asociación Psychoanalítica de Madrid, which recognized the author by inviting him to participate as one of the main speakers at the 7th meeting of Spanish-speaking psychoanalysts in 2024. Mariano Horenstein is a psychoanalyst with a teaching role at the Cordoba Psychoanalytic Association and the International Psychoanalytic Association. He is a former representative for Latin America on the IPA board. He is also the former editor-in-chief of Caliban Revista Latinoamericana de Psychoanálisis. He is also the author of the books Psychoanalysis in a Minor Language, Compass and Couch, Psychoanalysis and Its Necessary Foreignness, Tightrope Walkers, Adolescent Journey and Risk, and Couch Conversations. I am Nicole Zapian with Talks on Psychoanalysis, the IPA podcast featuring original readings from papers from the IPA Society's journals and Congress debates presented in the author's own voices. This podcast series is produced by the International Psychoanalytical Association as part of the activities of the IPA Outreach Subcommittee. Chair, Gaetano Pellegrini. Podcast coordinator, Florencia Biotti. Editing and post-production, Massimiliano Guilleri. This episode was produced by Ana Maria Martin Solar. To stay informed about the latest podcast releases, please subscribe today.
How do we listen to the language of sexuality today? I would like to take the liberty of deconstructing the phrase that brings us together, because despite the apparent naivety of its approach, it brings a necessary freshness to the rethinking of theory and clinical practice. The proposal is formulated not as an assertion, but as a question, and we must not fail to emphasize the affinity of psychoanalysis with questions. What Javier Cercas said about the novel applies to our discipline. It is the art of protecting questions from answers. For Maurice Blanchot, the answer was the disgrace of the question. The proposal can be broken down into 3 parts that should be questioned: denaturalizing any common sense we may ascribe to them, for this is what the art of the psychoanalyst consists of. More than anything else, make it the most obvious strange, make it foreign. The first part asks about our way of listening and takes for granted that our practice consists, a truism, of listening. Listening implies a distinct way of apprehending the world, a qualitative difference in relation to the visual way of approaching things. The invention of psychoanalysis meant the arrival on the scene of the order of listening, where what prevailed was that of the gaze. To ask how we listen implies taking for granted that there are different ways or that could even after an apparent receptive silence, hear nothing. Listening in psychoanalysis implies the renewal of a pact that is both ethical and methodological, and whose abandonment results in the annihilation of the unprecedented clinical possibilities offered by an analytical space. It is a matter of listening using a simple combination of rules that are much more than circumstantial. They are contractual guidelines that distinguish an analyst much more than the pipe or the couch. An analysis, after all, is a simple device where someone speaks in free association while being listened to by someone who pays them evenly floating attention, traversed by an implacable rule of abstinence. Just as John Berger was able to distinguish ways of seeing, we can distinguish ways of hearing, for there are different ways of doing so depending on the position of a listener who is even capable of reading what they hear, of hearing what they see. A psychoanalyst can and must listen not only within the clinic where they practice, but also outside the consulting room, trying to capture the language of their time. Freud puts us on the trail of an attitude that is not only ethical, but practical, in that it saves us from becoming obsolete by broadening the radar of analytical listening to social phenomena and new modes of malaise in culture. In general terms, and as long as the simple original tripod is preserved, a mode of listening can be traversed by many variables, individual, institutional, epochal, that refer us to the last part of the syntagm, how we listen today. Contemporaneity in psychoanalysis has probably found its best definition in Giorgio Agamben. In a text destined to become a classic, Agamben defines a countercurrent contemporaneity, where anachronism can reveal itself as a fertile resource for apprehending the zeitgeist. Although he does not cite it, the original Freudian temporality reverberates in his definition, since in our practice, different modes of apprehending time alternate: the time of chronology, chronos, and the time of opportunity, kairos, not to mention logical time or the subjective apprehension of temporality. But it is the idea of Nachträglichkeit that best defines it. This a posteriori not only updates the past, giving it new meanings, but also performs the magic, in clinical terms, of allowing the future to modify the past. The today of the syntagm, then, is a contemporaneity where we analysts choose not to be fashionable, to be untimely by vocation, to deploy our sensors in the face of current signals, not uncritically, but in order to surprise, to make foreign what we hear, and to listen to what is usually veiled by immediacy. Now, if what we hear today is the language of sexuality, it leads us to question, on the one hand, what a language is, and on the other, what kind of sexuality inhabits the spoken language of analysis. Perhaps it is easier to try to say what a language is not. A language is not an artifice that can be invented overnight, like Esperanto or Volapük. A language is not born planned, but is cultivated little by little and collectively. Just as cities that are designed programmatically, introduce inhospitableness into coexistence, while others that grow out of disorder and a generate turbulence history present fertile vitality and habitability. Invented languages fail as a means of communication that goes beyond the merely instrumental. The language we hear in analysis, the language we speak when interpreting, the language that is constructed in the intimacy of each session as a private language full of allusions and innuendo, that language that both the analysand and the analyst learn to consider as a foreign language, pregnant with possibilities, is the antithesis of Schreber's language or Victor Klemperer's Terti Imperi language or Orwell's Newspeak, and in any case is related to what Lacan named with a neologism, la langue. It is in this language, made up of founding words, woven into the mother tongue, the stuff of which language is made, the support of the unconscious, the generator of affects as effects, that sexuality is declined in analysis. We will see how, but first, it may be necessary to take a detour. The contemporary analysand. Psychoanalysis differs from science in its emphasis on the uniqueness of each case. Since Freud, each case requires the bracketing of all memory, whether it be theory, previous experience, or even previous sessions. Being a case-by-case practice, psychoanalysis is akin to art, or at least to clinical craftsmanship. The particular type of listening we practice produces, invents the analysand. If an analyst listens, it is not because someone speaks, but the other way around. We listen in such a way that we encourage the emergence of a particular type of speech. And it is not uncommon for an analysand to be surprised to hear themselves speak in a new way, encountering a type of listening that is also new. Although in the history of the analytical movement, things turn out differently. Someone had to appear who was attentive to listening to those whom no one wanted to hear in order for psychoanalysis to be possible. In this way, it was the hysterical woman who invented the figure of the psychoanalyst, forcing him to fine-tune his listening instrument in that distillation that goes from cathartic abreaction through post-hypnotic suggestion to the type of listening that we have been practicing for 120 years now. Thus, the clinical paradigm that gave birth to psychoanalysis was that of hysteria, which in the hands of the medicine of its time oscillated between bad faith, intrigue, and mental weakness, and only gained recognition thanks to Freud. The language of sexuality that Freud heard was that of hysteria and its tension, its detours, its elisions and mysteries, intended to awaken the desire of the listener. Hysteria thus became the paradigm, marked by repression, for reading Victorian and future sexuality, in addition to its clinical and cultural consequences. The clinical paradigm changed after the war, when, following the experience of the horror of concentration camps, psychosis became the new clinical reference point that broadened the field of our practice, forcing us to explore beyond the margins. On both sides of the English Channel and the Atlantic, different theories and approaches are being tried out to reach where repression was conspicuous by its absence. If hysterical women managed to flee the public theater of La Salpêtrière to make themselves heard in the privacy of newly opened analytical consulting rooms, psychotics are spoken for not only by their voices, but also by the analysts who testify on their behalf. In the same way that Primo Levi testified on behalf of those who were unable to do so, psychosis suddenly appeared in extensive case histories, in readings based on the writings of psychotic patients, in clinical experiments, and in a comprehensive review of the theoretical assumptions and technical variants of the analytical community. Now, what would be the current clinical paradigm today? I believe that, without a doubt, this place is occupied by the trance clinic. If we had to name it, only here it has not been necessary for an analyst to deign to listen, as with the hysterics, or for an analyst to bear witness, where it could not have been said otherwise, as with psychotics. Here, those who are called trans speak for themselves and even force us to listen to their testimonies, spoken with raw emotion from their own flesh and blood. Slowly, over more than 30 years, they began to make their testimonies heard, not necessarily within the confines of the analyst's office, although many of them have crossed paths with psychoanalysts at some point in their therapeutic journey. Following in Foucault's footsteps, the field of queer theory made itself heard through American and European theorists who denounced the deafness or prejudice of a large part of the analytical community, or the inaccuracy of some of our theorizations. From that moment until the present day, when trans discourse permeates the media with legitimacy that was unimaginable years ago, much water has passed under the bridge. Here, patients speak out and even shout to make themselves heard by psychoanalysts. The field of trance is diverse, and perhaps we should begin by making distinctions within it. But as a whole, it challenges both the phallic order and the supposed sexual binary that follows from it, replacing them with the banner of gender diversity and fluidity, which can be extended ad infinitum. They were the ones who have forced us to think, to review our theories, to adapt our devices. But what is interesting is that through their challenges, they have brought sexuality back to the forefront of psychoanalysis, where it seemed to have been lost after numerous theorizations in which sexuality lost ground to relational networks, object relations, aggressive tensions, or gender variants, where it seemed that there was nothing more to say about eroticism and sex, the very things that define psychoanalysis from its inception. The language of dissent, or blessed X. What trans people imply as a clinical paradigm has a correlate in a variant of language, the debated and debatable inclusive language, a contemporary invention. The language of sexuality today seems to be inextricably linked to feminist revolts and sex and gender dissidence. It is a language in which politics deliberately seeks to influence, a language that is not only a means of communication and subjectivation, of misunderstanding and alienation, of encounter and disagreement, but also a forum where it seems the dispute that has arisen around sexual difference must be played out. I need to make a kind of caveat here regarding the English-speaking audience of this podcast. I love my mother tongue, Spanish, the original language of this podcast. But English is more practical in many senses, this one included. In Spanish, for instance, the masculine form was assumed to be the standard. We used to say nosotros in a generic approach, even though women were included. Then the feminists arrived and we have changed and began saying nosotras when women were speaking, and it was okay. But then the queers took a stance saying nosotres with E in the oral way and X in the written way of expression. Having said that, imagine the changes in another language. It could be useful because Barbara Cassin, the French philologist, says that we always need more than one language to understand the determinations of our own. For someone of my generation, at least, there is something artificial about the inclusion of the suffix "y" in Spanish every time the masculine threatens to become the norm for the species. But it is not my intention to turn a particular case or a particular impossibility, my own, into an interpretative norm, but rather to try to read something in this contemporary use of language that is important for psychoanalysis. If one listens to feminist analysants, usually young women, making prolific use of E in its oral version or X in its written version, one notices that there is no naivety in their enunciation. The speakers of this strange contemporary idiolect know that it is an artifice, and yet they resort to it in the hope of piercing language, of disagreeing with the common sense that has settled and coagulated in a language. So they don't care about speaking in neutral language with interlocutors who don't. They don't care about cacophonous abuse or syntactic difficulties or the protests of the guardians of language. They don't care what the other person thinks, because the point is that every time someone speaks, they pronounce a micro-manifesto in which the linguistic order of the word is challenged. With all due respect for the freedom to think and speak as one sees fit, I cannot help but think that what is being done with language is the same as what is being done with sexual difference, turning them into conscious preferences, as if each person were faced with a menu of options to choose from each time, when in reality it is an iron grid imposed on us, and in the face of which the real choice, which does exist, is unconscious and beyond our discretion or whim. Language is chosen in the same way that neurosis or sexual orientation is chosen, where in truth we are chosen, objects of the choice, where the other, with capital letter, after all, the unconscious is the discourse of the other, Lacan dixit. The other is the one who decides. We believe ourselves to be sovereign, where in truth we decide little, as Freud soon warned. That other who speaks to us, the mother tongue, is the only thing Hannah Arendt finds what remains after the Nazi atrocities and the rejection of the homeland to which she believed she belonged. Language imposes itself on us, parasitizes us, includes us in a structure that surpasses and precedes us, that captures us suddenly at birth, even when vocabulary is acquired with evolutionary parsimony. Even our own name is the list of what belongs to us, as it was chosen by the other who preceded us. To analyze is to expand our margin of freedom, not by ignoring unconscious determination, but precisely by including them. I may be wrong, but I suspect that inclusive language will fulfill its task of challenging patriarchy and its instruments and will disappear through lack of use or become a hobby for enthusiasts, as is usually the case with all artificial languages. Perhaps we should bear in mind when we hear the vocalized proliferation of E here and there, the operation that the French writer Georges Perec performed on language. Perec, analyzed by François Dolto and Jean-Baptiste Pontalis, published an entire novel without using the letter E, the most common in his language, La Disparition. Considering Perec's history, an orphan of the Shoah, it is clear that this was not merely an experimental game, but one of the ways of dealing with absence. Perhaps contemporary speakers, including the letter E, almost as a rebellious signature in every utterance, do nothing more than highlight, through abundance, that which points to a flaw, a structural fault that we must deal with and that awaits us, all of us, just around the corner. At the crossroads where the contemporary paradigm of trans places as analyst, there is a way to respond both to its demands and its challenges, and to do so not only by wielding our old categories, but by allowing them to be revised or even set aside if necessary. I am referring to remembering that for psychoanalysis, this heteroclite set of diverse casuistry must be isolated in its singularity. Sexual positioning is not seen, but heard. It is in the register of listening that we are able to discern the fundamental differences in subjective position between a person who cross-dresses, for example, and a transsexual, or someone who is content with mirrored love objects without renouncing their original identity, where the significance of the visual, of appearance, and the ambiguity of simulation is highlighted. We oppose our instrument that listens where one usually looks. We listen from where someone speaks, regardless of the sex assigned to them or the gender with which culture has identified them. It is enough to listen to identify the enunciative position, and only a psychoanalyst can do that. We often read what we hear when we interpret by placing emphasis on homophones, for example, where it is the spelling variant that determines the meaning. When we read, the E reveals its hidden truth, because there it becomes, in written language, X, the letter that signifies the unknown par excellence. The language that best suits psychoanalysis is one that is sufficiently porous, fragmented, disjointed, or even deranged to make room for the unconscious. But ultimately, what matters to us, beyond the language in which it is spoken, is the treatment we give to language in analysis. There, an almost private language is constructed between analyst and analysand, with allusions and understandings, a language that is both the vehicle and the destination of a journey, even an intellectual adventure, and also an obstacle due to the identificatory marriages it entails. That language that speaks of sexuality in the cure should be listened to with the same respect that minor languages aroused in Deleuze and Guattari. The analytical language, which permeates every idiolect spoken in every analysis, must be treated as a minor language that deterritorializes the major one, makes it incomplete, pierces it. That power that some languages have over others considered major must also be granted to that powerful idiolect that simultaneously appears, is discovered and invented in an analysis. That particular way in which sexuality rescues the language of childhood, that language which, as Sylvia Molloy reminds us, sometimes requires a change of language in order to be expressed. The language of sexuality, after all, is the one that best reminds us of the foreignness that inhabits us, the way in which the unconscious always makes us strangers to ourselves, to borrow Julia Kristeva's felicitous expression. That language is always private and always says something else. That language has not yet found a better space to be spoken than that of analysis, nor a more hospitable oracle for its mystery to reverberate than the ear of a true psychoanalyst. The inclusion of the X for the neutral gender marks the new emergence of sexual dissidence in culture, operating in language by reintroducing the unknown, that which was collected by Freud and which we believed lost in times of post-repression. In algebra, the X is a notation for the enigma, for what is unknown, for what needs to be found out, the result of an equation, the anticipation of a laborious process. The X is a chiasm, that is a cross. It is a letter that cannot be missing in genetic sexuation, making the Y, contributed by paternal genetics, merely a possibility. It is also the omnipresent letter in the work of a great artist, such as Anthony Tapis. The X embodies sexuality as mystery, as excess and prohibition, naming both heaven and hell. The X that pairs inclusive language with contemporary paradigmatic clinical practice, thus reintroduces unease into language, a language that, paradoxically, is now more capable of naming sex than love, where sex is trivialized among younger generations who tend to allow themselves a much freer exercise of sexuality than their parents and grandparents. Talking about love, on the other hand, makes those who converse blush. Contemporary language, even that spoken in analysis, repeats in matters of love what once permitted the dalliances of sex that could not be spoken of, let alone practiced. But if the X matters to us here, it is not only because it embodies the mystery of sexuality. which may need to be restored in contemporary psychoanalysis among those of us who cultivate it, whether from the couch of the speaker or the armchair of the listener, but also because it is a figure of a crossroads, a junction, and as such, this letter is capable of becoming as relevant to psychoanalysis as the letter ñ is to the Spanish language. The ñ matters to us because there, from its non-existent presence in other languages, it alludes to the difference, to the singularity that the psychoanalysis spoken and thought in Spanish could eventually constitute.